Hello and welcome to Energy Transition Talk, the podcast that explores the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to a lower carbon future. I'm Paulina.
I'm Justine.
And I'm Jim.
And we are your hosts for Energy Transition Talk.
In this podcast, we seek to break down some of the most complex and important issues regarding the energy transition and how it impacts us. In each episode, we seek to tell a story by bringing you various perspectives about the energy transition so that you can make the best and most informed decisions for you and your communities.
So in our final episode of season 1 of the podcast, we want to look back at how far we've come and to look forward to where we hope to go from here.
To start off, we first speak with Dr. Scott Tinker, who wears a lot of hats. He is the State Geologist of Texas and a geology professor at UT Austin. He's a documentary filmmaker, host of an energy and climate talk show called Energy Switch, and host of the radio program Earth Date. We chat about the importance of media in informing and inspiring the public about energy, how we can carve a radical middle path forward, and what inspires him about the future of the energy transition.
We then do a rapid fire panel with 3 guests who we've had on previous episodes. Dr. Don Paul, the engineering professor at USC and the executive director of the USC Energy Institute. Dr. Iraj Ershaghi, director of the Ershaghi Center for Energy Transition, or E-CET, and a petroleum engineering professor at USC. And Michael Edwards, an energy consultant and visionary leader in social change, digital transformation, and the energy transition. We asked them to comment on various aspects of the questions, are we ready for the energy transition?
And finally, we end by reflecting on this season and our key takeaways from our conversations we've had throughout the podcast.
So without further ado, here's our conversation with Dr. Tinker. Dr. Scott Tinker is a professor of geology and director of the Bureau of Economic Geology at UT Austin, as well as the State Geologist of Texas. He is the founder and chairman of Switch Energy Alliance, a nonprofit whose vision is to inspire an energy-educated future through film. He is a documentary filmmaker, co-producing the award-winning documentaries Switch and Switch On, which have been screened in over 50 countries. Dr. Tinker is the host of Energy Switch, an energy and climate talk show appearing on over 200 PBS stations nationwide, and Earth Date, featured weekly on public radio stations throughout the country. He has written for publications including Forbes, Fortune, and Scientific American. Dr. Tinker has given over 800 lectures in nearly 50 countries. He holds a PhD in geological sciences from the University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Tinker, thank you so much for joining us on Energy Transition Talk. It is an honor to have you on the show.
It's great to be here with you.
So you've had a very interesting and impressive career path. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you into filmmaking? What inspired you to create the Switch Energy Alliance and produce the 2 documentaries?
Sure. 15 years ago now, I was being interviewed for a film that a great filmmaker was making. And afterwards he said, "Hey, have you ever written a book?" And I said, "I'm too lazy." He goes, "Well, you want to make a movie?" I said, "Yeah, sure. That sounds fun." And we set off in 2008 to film a piece on global energy. And of course, the '09 recession hit. So we were raising money during the Great Recession in the world and made it happen. We went to a dozen countries and produced Switch, which really was about the energy transition, but this was 15 years ago. Now the word's fancy. And anyway, it got very popular, and it ended up being quite popular in universities, university campuses. Loved it, and faculty still use it. It's getting a little old now, but we didn't film it with an answer in mind. We actually did it the old way. We went out and filmed and learned and post-produced for over a year and told a story afterwards. So it was an exploration, a great exploration. Many years later, I worked with Harry throughout. Harry Lynch is his name. And I said, "Hey, Harry, we left out half the world with our first film. All the world living without much energy." So we made Switch on energy poverty in another half a dozen countries. And that's a very different feeling film and a very different message, but it brings the whole spectrum together. So, film is very powerful. Love it. I am not a filmmaker. I'm just a pretty face. Harry is all the brains and all the intelligence. I just get in there and do my thing. But it's a very powerful way to tell a message. It's incumbent upon filmmakers to be as factually complete as they can be, because many films are completely factual, but they're not really factually complete. So that's the challenge.
And well, in these documentaries, you cover a wide range of topics related to energy and the environment, and thinking of sources and the uses and the impacts of energy, what the trade-offs and the challenges that we're facing on a daily basis. So what do you want, or what do you think that, what message do you hope that these films are still conveying to the viewers? Or maybe how important it is that media, the role that media plays when shaping the future of the energy transition.
Yeah. You said a very important two words there, Paulina, trade-offs. I think that's really valuable and vital that we all understand that. Media needs to and likes to speak in kind of binary terms. Okay. It's clean or it's dirty. It's good or it's bad. You're a believer or you're a denier. And the energy world is non-binary. Okay, it's a lot more complex than that, unfortunately, but that's the truth. Doesn't mean it's not solvable, but it's not simple. And so media needs to find a way, I think, and a few do it, to communicate that more, again, factually complete message around energy and the environment, the climate and the economy, than the binary versions that we are hearing, because that just creates division. What side are you on? Go online and try to say you're a supporter of nuclear and see what happens, or oil, for goodness sakes, or you're all wind all day, EVs only. Just see what happens when you start doing that. And so this concept of trade-offs is vital in the communication of energy, and they're very real. I've said this in a TED Talk to 1,100 students after setting it up a little longer than I am going to now, but I said there's no renewable energy, and there isn't. This is just a word you've learned in school, and people here as well. But everything comes from the earth, is mined, and then we collect energy with it, whether it's solar panels or wind turbines or drilling rigs and pump jacks or nuclear power plants and concrete. It all comes from the earth and the batteries. And then we make it into collection systems, and those wear out. They all wear out. And when we dump them back into the earth when they wear out, or we burn it and dump it in the atmosphere and do it over and over again. So it's not renewable. And this is important to understand. Yes, the sun and the wind are, and so is actually oil. Nature made oil too, but you have to do things to it to make it useful energy. So this is the great challenge, I think, as we're thinking about this trade-offs world, is how to balance all those things. And they all have a role to play. It's not a big competition. They all have different roles to play, and they're very valuable roles. And that gives us, the more things we include in that, the more options we have. And that brings us to the economic side of things. Markets love optionality. Markets love options. So when we start mandating away something like, you can only have EVs, well, that gets rid of a lot of options, and it doesn't really work very well. Or, you can't build pipelines. Okay, well, it's hard to deliver molecules. We're going to electrify everything. No, we're not. You have to have molecules for ammonia to make fertilizers to grow things, and for plastics, and for a lot of heat to make cement and steel. We have to have molecules to do these things. So it's those kind of binary approaches that I think confuse people, and then get them teaming up. Which team are you on? Instead of, hey, we're all kind of on this same team here. The world needs energy. How are we going to get it to them in a way that's clean?
Yeah, I think that's a very different and unique perspective to have. And I think throughout this podcast series, we've been, like, an overlying theme has been that, the energy transition is complicated. It's not black and white. There's no one size fits all solution. And we've been talking about different aspects of the energy transition and how we're going to adapt to our rapidly changing future. So now, closing the loop, we want to get your thoughts on where we are right now and where we are headed. But first, we want to ask you, what does the term energy transition mean to you?
Well, I think when people think of energy transition, they think we're leaving a bunch of things here behind and we're going to all these new things. Globally, that hasn't really happened yet. We just keep adding forms of energy. So coal continues to grow, oil continues to grow, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, biofuels, they're all growing. We're adding new wedges of things. So it's energy addition so far. And that's good because we have more people. We're adding more people to the world too, and they are coming out of poverty. So people that come in out of the emerging economies to developing economies and eventually to developed like ours need more energy. And I'm not talking about a few people. I'm talking about 5 billion people out of the 8.4 on the planet that live in some level of energy poverty today. 5 billion people. So this is unjust. If there's ever a good time to use the word justice, it's with economic poverty. We have to simply change that and put all of our passions into it. And a lot of good things happen when we do that. So this transition is really one of addition. And then the reduction is in emissions. So we add energy and we reduce emissions. It's that simple little formula: energy addition plus emissions reduction. And by the way, the land, the air, and the water matter too. So I'm kind of a big person on all the environment, the climate being a big part of that, but the land, the air, and the water matter as well. And the great challenge and the great irony is by lifting people out of poverty, you also improve the environment. And why do I say that? I've been in 60 countries, been fortunate, not in airports, into them, seen a lot of poverty. And without exception, the worst environments in the world, the worst physical environments, the dirtiest water, the dirtiest air, the worst soils are where it's poor. Simply can't afford to clean it up. There's no economic capacity to focus on those issues. So as you lift people out of energy and economic poverty, you also begin to have the capacity to clean up the environment. So it's a virtuous cycle. It's quite exciting when you think about it, but it's not often thought about in the energy, economy, environment flow. And that's really how things flow. So again, transition is, we're not leaving anything behind yet. We're just adding things, and that's okay. We can do that. And I want to be very clear, sub-regionally, sure. There are places like the rich world. We've transitioned 50% of our coal away. We've cut it in half over the last several decades and replaced it with other things. We're still growing energy demand, but it's not so much in coal as opposed to Asia, which consumes more coal now than the rest of the world combined. And that's okay. We built on coal in the US, so did the UK and Germany, and China is, and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Vietnam. I mean, I could keep going and going. We just have to figure out how to do that in ways that are better than we did it in the past, rather than saying none. No coal, no oil, no gas, no nuclear. These are messages that aren't being well received, and they shouldn't be. You know, many global leaders understand that it takes energy, and they prioritize energy security, as they should.
Why would you think that the additions and the emission reductions are so difficult to balance?
Well, 83% of our energy today comes from coal, oil, and natural gas in the world. And when you burn those, they produce carbon dioxide. So that's an important greenhouse gas. And methane as well leaks when you produce, natural gas is methane, CH4. And there's propane, butane, pentane, and all sorts of natural gases. So those are greenhouse gases as well. So it's not easy. It's not easy to continue to produce that much energy from so-called fossil fuels and reduce their emissions. That's a challenge. You have to capture them and do something with them. There have been technologies around for a couple decades, and we've been very big in this for over 2 decades at my day job, the Bureau of Economic Geology, probably the leading group in the nation, the Gulf Coast Carbon Center, of doing this physically. But it costs a lot of money to do that. So there's this economic challenge on who pays, where the rent's taken out to get it from capturing all the way to, moving it in supercritical phase, putting it in the ground and keeping it there and verifying that it stays there. Not easy. Or other ways to take up emissions as well. So that's one of the great challenges. It's just scale. Here's a visual. The solar and wind are growing faster than any form of energy in the world today. That's completely factual. And that's a rate. When you look at the data, you see them growing exponentially. When you scale them into the whole energy consumption picture, they represent about 10% of the growth in energy demand in the last 20 years. 10% of the growth. And 5% of the total energy, as much as they've grown. So there's 95% of everything else that's still growing. And this is the great challenge of scale. China consumes more energy than all of the electricity in the world combined. Okay, let me say that again. China consumes more energy than all the electricity in the world combined. People think of electricity as energy. It's It's a form of end-use energy, but it's only about 20% of the total energy that we consume in the world, electricity. There's all these other things. So these are big, big numbers. And that's why it's so challenging to think about replacing something. You not only have to continue to meet demand with addition, but you'd have to replace something else. And this is non-trivial. And you start to ask yourself, well, what does it take to do that? What would it take to replace something with something else? A lot of infrastructure, whether it's panels and turbines or new mines or batteries instead of fuels, moving the source of our transportation energy from OPEC for oil to China for batteries. And that's what's happened. China brilliantly controls 80% of the world's processing of all the key metals for solar, wind, and batteries. Brilliant move, Belt and Roads Initiative. But you got to recognize that's what's happening. If you're going to go away from liquid fuels for transportation to electric batteries, you're basically putting your energy security away from OPEC into the hands of China. And you got to recognize you're doing that. I'm not qualifying either one of those as better or worse. They're different. I'm an options guy. I think some of both would be good. More options, kind of nice. So this is where the critical thinking starts to come in, and we've got to have civil dialogue around these topics. By the way, I have 100% confidence in your generation. I have 4 kids, and they range from 34 to 23, and they're brilliant. They take after their mother, and they will solve these things if they have the tools and the understanding and the capacity to recognize, here, look at all these different components, and then take it to the next level. All the neat things that are coming out in the data world now from AI on, it's just phenomenal. So I have 100% confidence, but only if we give you, if we arm ourselves with this bundle of information that exists out there in the world and get out of that binary world.
Yeah, definitely. It can be daunting to think about, the scale of this global issue and thinking about all these complex challenges. What do you see as the best, most realistic path forward? You often talk about the radical middle. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I said that, 20 years ago somewhere, and it stuck. We've been talking about these things, energy, the economy, and the environment. That overlap space, if you think of it in those terms, is the radical middle. That's where the great challenges lie, incorporating each of those components. The data sit there, and you're not always right, and you got to compromise, and all the big problems lie there. Another way to think about that, we geologists love these triangle diagrams, ternary diagrams. Everything has to sum to 100%. So if you put energy and the economy and the environment on the points, well, you want 100% clean, you get 0% of everything else. You got to bring into the middle there and start balancing those in that trade-off world. So that's the radical middle. And it's growing. It's exciting to see it growing. People are engaging in it and really starting to deal with some of what I consider to be those important challenges, which again are not simple to solve.
And maybe thinking of your career, you've spoken to many organizations and stakeholders around the world over the years, industry, governments, academic, NGOs, and maybe thinking of maybe a radical middle amongst all of these. How can we find a common ground to work together to achieve a better energy future?
This is the great challenge. I'm often asked, so what's the answer? And I smile and say, well, there's not an answer. The answer involves things like recognizing that we just seek truth. We don't own truth. There's no patent on truth. Recognizing that science is a process. It's not an outcome. It's what we continue to do and always challenging ourselves. Critical thinking, lots of doubt in science. It comes in recognizing there are trade-offs, that nothing is perfect. And then in recognizing that we can't pit ourselves against one another in a binary world. You start to do that and you create the framework around which these challenges will be solved. Now, one thing we haven't mentioned yet, I don't think, is some of the reality of energy. The reality of energy is that there are some forms of energy that are not very dense and others that are extremely dense. And what do I mean by that? The bang for the buck, if you will, the amount of energy packed into a weight or a volume or an area. Some things just are lucky that way. They have just a lot more energy in them. And modern societies are built on those denser forms of energy. Natural gas, hydrogen, nuclear being the densest, and liquids as well. solar, wind, biofuels being not dense at all. It takes a lot of stuff to collect enough sun to do something at scale. So this concept of energy density is very important. And at the end of the day, physics tends to win. It's kind of immutable. Economics has some fundamental principles too, but they change a little. Passion does and all that. But pesky old physics just keeps coming back year after year with some first principles and some fundamental laws that you can't violate. And that's where energy is mostly headed, is toward denser energy to power denser societies and growing population up until mid to late century. And I think that kind of frames an answer. It doesn't mean we can't have some other things in it. In a complementary options world, we should have other things in it. But the big aggregate things are headed toward the denser space. We can perturb it, we can forestall it, we can mandate it away and legislate around it. Justine, you're going to be a lawyer. You can try to force physics to not happen, but eventually physics wins. And that's not bad. The upside to that is some of these really dense forms of energy, they don't have any emissions. Nuclear power doesn't have emissions. It has a little bit in making this stuff, but so does wind and solar when you make this stuff. Hydrogen has no emissions. Now you got to get the hydrogen and make it somehow, and that requires maybe splitting methane, CH4, or water, H2O, to get the hydrogen. But so there are some emissions along the way, but in the bigger picture, not many emissions. So the neat part about all this is we get denser. It also improves some of the emissions challenges and lower use of land, less water, better air quality, lower pollution of soils. A lot of neat things that start to happen as we go that direction. So a framework for an answer heads towards density, but I can't force that on. I can't put nuclear in central Ethiopia today. You can't do that. There's just a whole lot of, pick your favorite country, Bangladesh, although the Middle East, UAE has 4 nuclear reactors now. The Middle East is building nuclear, okay? They get it. And using molecules for other things. So start looking at that. And at the end of the day, I would say, you really look at what leaders do, not what they say. This is very important. Leaders prioritize energy security every single time. You may not say it, but watch what they're doing every single time, even Germany. When the natural gas quit flowing from Russia to Germany, German use of coal went up 13% in 1 year and closed down 3 nuclear reactors. And climate scientists were aghast, and they should be. Close down the no emitting stuff, build more coal because it's secure. Even Germany, which is a very clean thinking economy. So you can look at example after example of this around the world.
That is very interesting, and it does give us a better and a bigger picture of maybe where we're moving towards, or what we can actually act on. And maybe as we come near the end of our conversation, we have this question and kind of thinking about the future. And is there something, or maybe a couple of things, since you are an options person, that inspires you about the future of the energy transition?
Oh, I'm inspired by many things. One is I have the fortunate circumstance of meeting with a lot of students and young professionals, and you guys inspire me. You do. When I just see the way you're thinking and how hard you're working to address some of these, and your passion for keeping the earth in better shape than maybe the prior generations did, I'm inspired by that. Okay. I'm also inspired by the optimism and hope I've seen around the world in countries that don't have much. It's incredible to me, really, and I don't know how to say this correctly, but there's hope in some of the poorest among us in the world. And I think they feel and see the future coming in a way that's better than they currently have. I get concerned a little bit with the fear that's communicated to and almost imposed on the youth in the U.S. and Western Europe, of the fear and the lack of optimism. I don't like that. I think there's so much to be optimistic about, and I think we don't do a service by scaring everybody we have to be wary and aware and certainly clear-eyed about things and work to fix them. But the world isn't ending in 15 years. It's just the communication of existentialism from existential threats from anything, climate or otherwise, is misplaced. It's just not accurate. It isn't real. Okay. And that's been said for 60 or 70 years now, and here we are. So I think that the hope I see is in people are getting more aware of these things, and that there's great work to be done. It's not something to be fearful of. It's something to push into, to lean into, to take on and address and solve, just like we did throughout the last century with all sorts of new invention. So I find that very hopeful, but I'm not a, I'm a scientist. So I see things in a world of hope, but laced with scientific challenges and skepticism and questioning and always wondering, nothing's settled. Yeah, how do you drive forward on that? Is that real? And that's where I think we confuse hope with, I'm called a pragmatist or a realist, or sometimes accusationally and sometimes in a compliment, both. But I am pretty pragmatic about all this stuff, or at least I try to be. And I find that those who get into that space, they really can address some of this stuff. It's happening, and very hopeful.
Yeah, I think having that mindset of realistic optimism is very crucial, especially for
I love those words.
Generation.
I'm going to steal those, Justin. Realistic optimism.
So I'd love to end with, is there any message you would like to leave our listeners with? How can we all be a part of the energy transition, and how can we learn more about this complex but very critical issue?
Sure. Think about the transition in the way of addition. So don't get worried if we're not leaving anything behind yet. That's okay. We're adding new energy, and that's a very powerful thing. That allows us then to do so many other good things, lifting people from poverty and cleaning up the environment. So I leave you with the thought of that triad almost, and that by addressing all of them, we improve all of them. If you get too far out in the corners of any one, you actually can hurt the other ones. So I kind of leave you with that thought and challenge it. Think about it. We got lots of materials for you at the switchon.org site, a not-for-profit. So much stuff there, films and shorts and PBS things and the Energy Lab and all sorts of things. I put my presentations online there, the actual animated PowerPoint slide. You can grab them and have them and impress your faculty and use it away, but really get involved that way. And I think, again, you'll solve it. And I thank you for that, because I'm getting old and I need you to solve it.
Great. Thank you so much for being on our show. And we'll definitely link to all your films, TED Talks, energy shows in the show notes. We then spoke with 3 guests who we've had on previous episodes to get their take on the ultimate question: are we ready for the energy transition? First, we brought back Dr. Don Paul, engineering professor at USC and the executive director of the USC Energy Institute, and asked him to recap for us the overall trends and challenges that we are seeing in the energy transition.
I think that one of the things that you've heard throughout this series is something we pointed out at the beginning. I mean, this transition is arguably of a scale that nobody alive today has seen before. And if you think in a time frame of 50 years, a lot of things can change. And that's one of the challenges you're seeing today in the private sector, as people have been directing and continue to direct a significant amount of capital into renewable energy sources. But primarily today, renewable energy, solar and wind is what comes to most people's mind. Biofuels is in there too, at a smaller scale. But solar and wind have primarily accounted for a major part of the growth in energy demand. One of the challenges that this transition has is it has to do 2 things simultaneously. Unlike past energy transitions that have occurred over the last, say, 400 years, the new energy sources go to growth, But here they also have to substitute for existing sources, and that requires much, much more demand and investment to meet that demand. So the energy demand of the world is not going down. If anything, it may actually grow up over the years as the developing economies become more prevalent in terms of their economic output, particularly in Asia. We've seen this, for example, in India, which has now come up to be a major energy consumer. And in their current choices of activities, most of the growth in power production has come from coal, which in a way is, from a climate objective, is going backwards. And the reason they're doing it is simply from an economic point of view, that appears to be a better investment, and also meets the requirements that it's baseload. It's something that can always be on. This is an issue we've seen in California. California has pushed hard for several decades, really, to grow their renewable portfolio. It's a requirement for the utilities in California. With that growth, however, has come the variability. That is, we now have, in some situations, generate surplus electricity in the daytime and have shortfalls at night where we have to actually import power from other states. So people are working on how to do that balancing, and they're working on energy storage technologies and things like that. But all of this takes time, and it takes time for both the producers of energy and the consumers of energy to maybe make adjustments in their usage patterns to make this work. And so that's part of this transition process. The other key thing that's going to be essential to be able to afford the level of investments that people have talked about, calculated, modeled, requirements on the order of $100 trillion. This is an enormous amount of investment, several times the level of investment currently going in from both public and private sources into energy. So the question is, what's going to raise that? One of the things that raises it is that the technology involved improves to the point where the returns on the investments are better. And that means lowering costs, improving efficiency, and as well as new technologies substituting into the system as well. So all of these things have to play out. So when you come back to the question, are we ready? I guess my view is we are ready in the sense that people are moving on this. People are trying to do things that are in the right direction. Is it at a scale that will be needed? No, it's not at a scale that will be needed. And I think that's really where we are. But that's going to be uneven. That's not going to be the same. It isn't just like it's not the same even in the individual states in the United States. It's certainly not going to be the same around the world. Are we ready for the transition? I think the answer is people are working on it.
Yeah.
But there are fits and starts, and there's going to be fits and starts because as you scale these things up, there's going to be side effects that you maybe didn't think about. And those are things that both technology, policy, and economics will eventually work their way through. So it's difficult to predict the timing, but it's part of the reason why we could expect the transition to take much more time, perhaps, than some people would wish to be the case. But you have to do it prudently and constructively. One of the things we've been emphasizing is constructive transition, something that you don't plunge on to such a point that you bring about effects that you don't want, and then you have to reverse yourself. I think the idea is to be able to make it consistent and steady. And that gets into the decarbonization drive, which spills over from the energy business into every other business. I mean, you're seeing the battle that have occurred right now, small scale, but it's emblematic, in my view, of the kind of things that have to be resolved, where there are people that want to displace in restaurants gas-powered cooking and replace it with electric. Well, that sounds okay, except for the people who run the restaurants. So the energy transition is going to be like that. I think, as we mentioned, that I think you have to push forward on all these fronts because, as we've seen with other technologies, in practice. Over time, some proved to be much more effective, much more scalable than others. And so you need to do a number of these things as opposed to just picking one and pushing forward, because things happen. I mean, things happen technically, things happen politically, things happen economically. And so it's not like the whole world is being guided by one hand as you go forward in the transition. It's going to be uneven. And I'm sure other prior transitions were the same way. So there's lots of reasons to be encouraged. And the fact that there's a lot of efforts, as Professor Ershaghi pointed out, not only obviously here, but throughout the world, on pushing in the direction of positive, constructive transition. But because there are a lot of unknowns, there's also an enormous amount of money that's going to have to be invested in pushing this along. And it will, because of all of those things, it won't be the way we think it will. It's hard to make predictions for 50 years in the future and expect them to come out. Yeah. So therefore, you have to keep your actions, keep your bets wide, because you don't know exactly how it's going to play out. And we've seen this in other technologies. In the digital technology realm 50 years ago, there is nobody that would have predicted where we are today. Not even close. So I think you've got the similar kind of thing. And again, let's make sure that we have positive directions in all the things we're trying to do, decarbonizing, transitioning, but at the same time, do things that are constructives so that when we do have what appears to be really winning strategies, we can, in fact, continue to advance those to the scale that's needed.
We then asked Dr. Iraj Ershaghi, director of the Ershaghi Center for Energy Transition, E-CET, and petroleum engineering professor at USC, about the challenges of balancing decarbonization with other important interests like energy security. He's cautious about the potential energy security issues with importing oil from other countries.
Give you an example in California as an example. Our demand for fossil fuel has increased, and we are importing more fossil fuel than we're actually producing. As a matter of fact, with certain rules and regulation, they're discouraging domestic production in this state. So what's going to happen is that there seems to be a preference to use foreign oil or international oil and not use the domestic oil. That doesn't make sense. So if you talk about decarbonizing, you talk about the decommissioning fossil fuel producing facilities, you shouldn't be importing, because that creates the energy security issue. Just imagine a state like California with a dependence on the tech industry, with the Googles and with the Microsoft offices, and then you look at the development that has taken place in the Silicon Valley, and then the dependence on all of us we have on computer and energy. Imagine for 2 or 3 days that we don't have any imports coming in, because that could happen. And it happened before. It happened before where we had gas station line up, cars fighting with each other, trying to get gasoline. So it gets to the point that a state like the state of California will actually endanger its energy security because of certain policy. It's just something that needs to be studied, and it needs to be addressed. And I think an atmosphere has been created that the fossil fuel is the cause of the problem, but the fact of the matter is that I don't see any place that says that those shall not use fossil fuel, because, as I said, we are actually increasing import. So dependence on an international crude oil import, listen to California, it creates an energy security issue, which is not very healthy.
We also asked Dr. Paul about the challenges of balancing decarbonization with energy security in relation to renewable energy. The Inflation Reduction Act, for example, includes tax credits for electric vehicles, but excludes EVs containing certain battery components made in China, which dominates EV battery production. We asked Dr. Paul whether the US should prioritize domestic supply chains for renewable energy in order to safeguard energy security, even if that might mean slowing down the pace of decarbonization.
There are efforts to ramp up solar panel production in the United States. China, of course, has a huge share of the global market. They have the infrastructure to make solar panels at a vast scale we do not have in the United States. They also have a tremendous cost advantage currently. So there is a case where, as I mentioned before, if you can change with new technology the cost structure, then you can change the way these markets developed. If you go to a utility in a state, if it's a regulated utility, for example, and you say, well, you want you to double your solar energy supply, they have to source those solar panels from somewhere. If you say you have to use the limited supply that's in the United States at twice the cost, what does that do to the consumers? They have to raise the cost of electricity.
Sure.
I mean, this is basically the issue that happened with the offshore wind off of the New Jersey, where the developers backed out because they couldn't get the cost structure they needed to produce the electricity at a cost that they could make the investments with. So all of these things can, in fact, and I personally expect they will get resolved, but they take time to do that. It takes time to build up these supply chains. What we don't want to do, I think, is start making choices that force decisions you don't like. For example, because of the war in Eastern Europe, gas supplies became stressed in Western Europe. At the same time, there has been a long-standing motivation, France being the exception, of course, to shut down nuclear plants, such as in Germany. Now, all of a sudden, the nuclear power is not there, the gas isn't there, and what do? They reopen coal plants. So those are the kind of reversals, in my view, that's why we have to start talking about prudent and constructive transitions, not transitions that force you into corners that you won't be happy with. The challenge we have in California is we've been importing oil for quite a while. It's grown significantly and will continue to grow. We import 95% of the natural gas in California. And now we're supporting large quantities of power. So California is getting into a situation where it's going to be primarily dependent on imports of energy of all kinds. That puts you in a position where you no longer control a big chunk of your infrastructure. And if events intervene, weather, natural disasters, political intervention, as Professor Ershaghi pointed out, which has occurred in the past with oil, then what do? You know, all of us have been in California for a while, I know this sounds, you know, in many parts of certainly historically, even in California, the idea of brownouts, rolling blackouts. This is in the the epicenter of technology, and we don't know whether we'll have enough power. You have to ask yourself, does that make sense, right? So that's why the energy security issue is part of the energy story. It has to be.
Finally, as Dr. Ershaghi is the director of the USC Energy Center for Energy Transition, or E-CET, we asked him to elaborate on what E-CET has been up to in working towards its goals for decarbonization and innovation.
E-CET being part of a School of Engineering, and our mission is really focusing on technology development. So the number of projects that we are sponsoring, and we providing seed funds, and we encouraging the faculty participants, are some of the key issues related to decarbonization, converting carbon dioxide to solids, liquids. We are working on membranes, and these are the basic elements of making progress in terms of removing the carbon. We're working on ways actually that in transportation vehicles that you can actually remove the carbon. Also, we are actually supporting a new center is going to be established at USC that has to do with this subsurface storage of carbon dioxide. So we're doing our share in terms of what technology would it take, what innovation would it take to actually fight the carbon. That's a very important goal of the E-CET. But meanwhile, in terms of alternative fuels, we have faculty working on geothermal, which is not going to be a huge percentage of energy supplies, but we're still working on that. We are actually supporting a faculty who is developing alternatives to steel for storage and transportation of hydrogen, because we think hydrogen can be, but it has got a lot of problems. So not only we are addressing the fact that fossil fuel will be around for some time to come, but better do something about carbon, decarbonization. We are also doing something in terms of alternative sources of energy. But again, our focus is making progress and very fast progress in these areas, and we know exactly what the critical areas are, and we're focusing on that. But even at the speed that we are going, is going to take some time, because you really have to give it a due attention in terms of the development of technology and in terms of finding solution to certain problems that we've had in many, many development areas. So that's really the focus of the E-CET, fighting the carbon, coming up with a solution for decarbonization, and also working on alternative sources of energy. One other thing I should mention is that a very key area of research at USC is really what the industry, petroleum industry, with its expertise can offer to the energy transition. We've identified that about 3-4 million idle wells that exist in the United States, rather than being plugged and abandoned, can actually provide the storage for a number of legacy assets that come from even renewables. So that's one of the areas that we're working, not only in terms of energy security, in terms of using energy storage subsurface, but we're also working on legacy assets from solar, for instance. What do you do with when a solar panel reaches to its age, and how would you get rid of the leftovers? Because these are toxic materials that have to be disposed of properly. So we're using the cavities of the holes for this purpose. We have actually a faculty working on that. Same thing happened in the wind turbine blades, and you're going to have to come up with ways to do that, because the average public is not really aware of the fact that the landfills cannot take toxic material, and many of the things that have to do with the solar and wind turbine are actually toxic materials. You can't put them in the landfills. So we are taking some steps in the direction of handling legacy assets from these renewable sources. Being an academic institution, we always gauge the interest of the students, what direction they're going, because they hear all these discussions and they want to do something positive. I'm very proud of the caliber of students and the attitude they have in terms of trying to be useful. And when I look at the range of the new courses being offered, I can see the tremendous interest in, for instance, decarbonization. This is something they want to do. I see some interest in for instance, biofuels. In fact, as many of you may know, USC has a very active program in biofuels, and however, we have students who are actually looking at the limitations of the technology and what it could be done to perhaps expand it. I have students who are actually interested to do something in geothermal, various ways. As a matter of fact, we're going to have a paper pretty soon at the Western Regional Meeting of SPE that talks about there are many parts of the world that actually don't have the right temperature, as you call geothermal temperature, but the water is hot enough that you can use for space heating or other purposes. And we have students actually working on that. So the interest expressed by the student and the attitude that they have in terms of being useful and doing something in this area is really amazing. It's very impressive.
Great, thank you both. So to conclude, I want both of your 1-minute answers. If there is one thing that you want our listeners to take away from this podcast, take away about the energy transition, what would that be?
The scientists are doing at national labs and universities are actually focusing on various ways of improving the technology, developing new technology. What is really missing in my mind is the attitude of people and attitude, especially of the younger people in the high school age, because we just had a competition that showed that they really know very little about energy. So what we need to do is not really technology development. That's being done. What we need to do is improving the understanding of people about how serious it is, the transition we are facing and what they should do about it. As a matter of fact, we just printed a whole bunch of pens and we says, and as I think we got a quotation from one of you that says the energy transition depends on me. Each and every one of us play a role in terms of how much energy we use, how efficient we use it. And so we can all contribute to that. But again, it all boils down to the public education.
I guess I would conclude by saying I'm very positive about the transition. I think that at the same time, we need to build out the understanding broadly across society. We need to build out the technical and practical competencies needed to implement the transition. And we have to be smart about implementing it in a constructive fashion so that we don't get partway and then end up doing something different because we didn't think through the constructive parts of the transition and didn't build a permanent solution.
Thank you both for those invaluable insights and for sharing your perspectives of where we're at right now in the energy transition and all the work that is still to be done and maybe looking to the future and where we want to be in years from now. So thank you.
Happy to be here.
We also invited Michael Edwards, an energy consultant and visionary leader in social change, digital transformation, and the energy transition, back onto the show to get her thoughts on whether our technology is ready for the energy transition. We put a lot of emphasis on wind or solar, and for good reason. But are there any other overlooked renewable sources or technologies we should be paying more attention to? We first asked her to talk about some upcoming developments and opportunities in the energy transition that we should be keeping an eye on.
I think we need to be looking at it always as a portfolio. I mean, that's been the lion's share of all the jobs that I've had in the last 33 years is looking at things in a portfolio manner. So I think a good example is some of the EV or the battery technologies. When we looked at hydrogen and thinking about how we make sure that if we have an interruption in hydrogen, that we're actually taking some of the battery skids in a clustered way. And the clusters actually help us to hedge any down or any pull from the grid. So you can actually be charging at the same time that you're going to offload your batteries for helping your hydrogen plant. So this is really unique teams that are put together to not only look at the financial side, but how do we take the technologies, connect it together. I also like the biofuel side. I think that's quite interesting because it's a connection to our environment. We think about these landfills and placing natural gas or gas plants, biofuel gas plants around these landfills in a way that we can actually turn the gaseous fuels that come off of the landfills into a power for the local communities. I think this is exciting. I don't think we need to throw out any based on a business case that's one of my concerns. And this is where, you know, back in the day when we look at CCU, we said there's no business case. Look at all the infrastructure we have to build. So we kind of threw it out in some cases. I'm not speaking on behalf of my company, but in general as an industry. That's where you actually find yourself going back to square one every time that you bring it up. And that's really bad for innovation. So you want to be in a position where you have, maybe you need to downsize your team and allow someone, what I would call tinkering, you know, tinkering these ideas, allowing the culture of your organizations to actually feel as if they can tinker on the side. By the way, most people do tinkering, whether they're in the office or they're out of the office doing something like developing their own company or their own gig on the side. So if you're able to bring that into your corporation, leverage it into your culture, I think it's a huge win. And we do have organizations that understand this very well.
Absolutely. We also asked Michael to tell us some of the biggest challenges in deploying and implementing these innovations and technologies.
I can tell you what's hitting my desk right now is the fact that we have entrepreneurs that cannot get capital. And that is the heart of our innovation here in the US in particular, but around the world. Canada, you know, I worked for 2 entrepreneurs in my career, one early in my career out of Aberdeen. It was Aberdeen local that decided he wanted to make a name for himself in a new technology, and he did. He actually, it was a very disruptive technology, and without him being in the market, it would not have shifted the drilling market. We drill this way today, and this is rotary steerables, but that was good 35 years ago. And that entrepreneur took it upon himself to do that. He had investments and he took a major risk. Those entrepreneurs are out there, but what I'm hearing over and over is I have to bootstrap it. You know, I have to use my own capital. I have to use my own time and energy and my friends. Well, now the challenge is those individuals that have been working on a new idea can't scale up. They have to borrow money. In order to borrow money, you've got to prove that you're going to return over a period of time that's reasonable with the investors. So I've been involved with 2 pitches over the last year, and it's not pretty. It's very ugly. And I still remain to share this because when you look at innovation, it is not in the major companies. Despite what everybody believes, there are some innovations that come out of a grassroots hallway conversation, but very few. And this is where we're seeing the VC capital and the major oil companies being a good utility to help support. But then we ask the question, for what purpose? Are you bringing in these technologies to actually deploy? Because a good 80% of the energy in a, you know, because that's my job when I had been working for all the companies that I worked for, including BP, was to deploy. And deploy takes a good 80% of the energy and the capital is to deploy. And if your job is not to deploy and implement the technology, then what are we doing here? And so when you think about the big macro level challenges that we have, CCUS has been around for decades. We've known this, we've done this. You know, what is it going to take to deploy that? And I'm just bringing that one as an example. Things should not take this long to deploy. Hydrogen the same way. We have very interesting, and what I think is probably one of the most exciting things is that we've changed our collaboration model overnight. We're not going through the conventional structures of let's spend all this time on contracts and negotiation, a one-to-one business-to-business relationship. We do that, of course, in our supply chain as routine. But when it comes to things like hydrogen, I worked on a green steel project here recently here in the US, and we are thinking much more broadly around the partnerships and what it takes to bring to the table. I think this is a really interesting incubator for innovation, but it also moves the question that we don't have the right structures in place. And we can hear, you know, I often hear the IRA. So the IRA is just a small portion of what we have as incentives. But your base case should never be on an incentive program. It should be on the basis of how you bring your portfolio together, hedge risk on one side or the other. I think the biggest barrier is always leadership. I think having the leadership mindset. I'm really fascinated right now with the upstream leaders that have moved over to the renewable space. It's a very different mindset. And you can imagine being in the upstream where the word margin wasn't part of the language. And so this is where I do a lot in the renewable space is I came into an operating company understanding margins because I was a service hand. I worked on the rigs, and then I graduated to doing integrated projects across 6 divisions for Baker Hughes and some others. So I am interested in this leadership mindset of how you have been schooled in one area, but you're running a business to the other. So this is probably one of the biggest barriers that I see. And then, of course, you see the symptoms of the real issue of leadership as being the turnover. Your C-suite is turning over more rapidly than we've ever seen, particularly in my generation. So that's where people like myself and others are coming into the industry as being very experienced people that want to make a difference.
Absolutely. And we're looking at this from people that are inside the industry. And another part of what we've been working towards and trying to understand is the public or the individual, and specifically thinking of public education. And a big question that we have and that we always come back to is, are people ready to commit to the energy transition? So thinking about like the public, and do we think that they're appreciating the state of where the energy comes from? How do you think that the public is responding to the energy transition? And do you think that there are spaces to better inform the public about where we're at the moment, and maybe how they can get involved and thinking about moving forward?
Thank you for bringing that up, because it does start with the public. I mean, it's why we have energy. We have taken for granted a lot of the energy sources that afford us to conduct the lives that we're in, all the lamps that are around here, and it just going down to the gas station, being able to do the things that our great grandparents did not do. I think this is really, really important. But when you look at some of the sources of the real problems in education, is you look at our textbooks, the word energy is non-existent. And energy is very important for us to understand at a very young age. I have done my fair share of STEM education back dating when I was in high school, hands-on science program here in Texas. And it was an Amico mother of 5 that asked me to come along with her. And she was very convinced we needed to talk about science in a tangible way. And energy is no exception. And so that, just in a little nutshell, that program actually was recognized here in Houston and in the Spring Branch School District. And we ended up in Texas legislature session campaigning for all education at the elementary school having a lab, a hands-on lab. Before, it was a textbook exercise at an elementary school level. So this is something that we need to be thinking about, as some practical things that we can do. In that case, we now know every elementary school that's built in the state of Texas will now have a lab that little kids can now go into a science lab and touch what science is. That makes it meaningful. So this is where we understand medical. A lot of kids come out, want to make a difference in our hospitals. We've done a fine job with connecting up with that social impact. We should not think of that any different from energy. I have always felt, and I've told many this, that we have been in a bit of a defensive mode as an industry, defending our license to operate, our social license to operate. And that is not where we need to be. We need to be in a much more proactive way. This is an energy security issue. It's an educational issue. It is about our understanding of how energy can help others around the world. Access is a huge, huge issue for us. Scott Tinker on one of his judging boards, so a big fan of what he's doing, but we need more of Scott Tinker. We need more of cloning him around the world. Not one person can do this.
Yeah, and since maybe we have only one Scott Tinker, how can we inspire or maybe encourage people to further commit to the energy transition?
I think, going back to education, it's really important that we think about some basic reminding of people. What happens when, your refinery goes down? What happens when the power goes out? I mean, we knew that with the millions that were affected here in Texas with the Valentine freeze a couple of years ago. We also look to an education of our authorities, whether that's ERCOT, our governor, our state and local authorities, that they have a role to play. And we need to understand that we inform that as well as a collective, not necessarily a reacting. So this is really important for our folks to be more educated on what that looks like. And I think this is where the energy companies make a difference with helping the communities they're working in.
We've been working towards having, of course, this podcast be part of that public education that we're trying to reach broader audiences. Maybe a lot of listeners that might not have been as well versed about the energy, about what it means, about what it entails, different types of energy transitions, different materials. So using this space as this possibility of starting that education and folks that might not have been as committed or as knowledgeable about these aspects. What would you have them take away from our conversation?
I think one of the takeaways is when you travel the world and you see, how people turn on their stoves, just something so basic. And this is also mainland Europe. It's not that far. It's across the border here in Texas. It's really important to see those sources of energy. Our educators can stimulate that enthusiasm to understanding that source of energy and where it comes from. I often not often, but I do like to tell a story. It's pretty personal, but when I was 10 years old, I saw my first rig site. My grandfather took me out to a Navajo reservation in the Four Corners in Colorado at the border of New Mexico. And he thought it would be a good idea for me to sit in the back seat with his company. We call them company men at that time. And he was a Navajo chief, actually, working for the company my grandfather worked for. And my grandfather was driving, and I remember us pulling up to this reservation. And I saw on one side, the reservation, the conventional reservation, and people walking around, and just like you would in any other form of social activity. But on the other side was, an operation. And I had people come and usher me as a young girl to go in and have some food. And it was really nice. But I came out, and my grandfather, they were there for a safety reason, which was having to do with explaining to the chiefs and the leadership of the reservation that, this fence is electric fence. We don't want you going over. We have maintenance here. So it was very, very safety oriented. But I walked away asking the question in the back seat of the car, as you can imagine, riding down the road after we left, is I made the assumption as a 10-year-old that we were actually drilling for water. Because you think about it, you see something drilling in the earth, it's going back to reservation, we're having food, but that was not the conversation. It was, no, it's about natural gas. We're actually powering the reservation with power, and they're wanting to actually expand the reservation infrastructure to do all this for the folks that are living. And there was a pressure in their conversation, and it was great. It opened up my mind to what natural gas was at a very young age. it also connected up the social impact of why. So yeah, that was many other examples of that. But I think when you were asked to go into the energy sector, there still is a huge untapped opportunity, even at the university level. Even though we may drill and talk about petroleum engineering as some abstract, we're not connecting up the social impact of why petroleum is very important. Why is natural gas? And then when you do go into a area just like this Navajo reservation, why are you there, and are you leaving it in a better condition when you leave?
I appreciate you sharing your own story with us, because I think that a lot of times it takes maybe those moments to realize that there's something bigger, and that there's something behind that might not have sparked interest otherwise. So we have found out that there could be even more kind of guidance through education into what energy is, even from younger ages, not waiting until they're in higher education. So maybe our conversations here spark some of that interest on folks who are trying to find their path. So thank you so much for your time today, Michael. It's been wonderful as always. Thank you so much for sharing this space with us and all your knowledge.
My pleasure.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this season of Energy Transition Talk. We hope that through exploring different aspects of the energy transition, we've given you a lot to think about in terms of the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to a low-carbon future.
Certainly is a lot to think about. We started off this season by defining what the energy transition is and why it matters. We learned about energy demand and the implications of global events on energy security. We talked about energy poverty and what a just transition looks like, as well as critical minerals and lithium mining. We broke down the energy laws for the federal and state levels that affect our daily lives. We discussed the future of oil and gas and the cost of going green.
And we got a utility perspective into how the electric grid works and the benefits of using electricity during certain hours of the day. We asked students about their understanding of the duck curve. And we also learned about emerging technologies, including carbon capture and storage, monitoring methane emissions from oil and gas operations, enhanced geothermal, hydrogen. And we asked experts about the potential of these technologies to contribute to the energy transition.
We discussed the future of electric transportation and how we can rethink mobility, and heard from community members on their experience driving electric vehicles. And finally, we talked about the future of the energy workforce and how we can adequately prepare the next generation workforce for the broad range of skills that we'll need for the energy transition. So we've learned a lot through these conversations, and hope you have too.
It seems like a long time ago that we got started on this project, but it's been a very interesting journey. One of the things that I've been curious about is what are the key takeaways of my two co-hosts. So we're going to let both Justine and Paulina have their say and to figure out what it is that most impacted them. Justine, what are your key takeaways?
Yeah, so through this podcast, I've been truly inspired by how passionate and dedicated people are about the energy transition and the amazing things that people are doing to help lead the way towards a more decarbonized future. I think it can be so easy to read the news and feel despair about the state of our world and think, our planet is headed in a certain direction and there's nothing we can do to stop it. But the reality is that there's no planet B, and we don't have time to sit on our hands and leave it up to other people to figure it out. I think the conversations we've had have also made clear to me that the energy transition is not a black or white issue. Climate change is not a black or white issue. It's not an either or, like we can either overshoot 2 degrees Celsius and we're all doomed, or we don't and we're fine. It's more of an incremental thing where 2 degrees Celsius is different from 2.5 degrees, which is different from 3 degrees. Every 0.1 degree counts. So there's always something that we can do to mitigate the impacts of climate change and contribute to a lower carbon future. And there are also many career paths and ways that we can all contribute to the energy transition. We really need everyone, from entrepreneurs and lawyers and policymakers to educators and community organizers and media producers to researchers and electricians and engineers. Everyone can play a role that's best suited to their unique interests and skills. We are all a part of the energy transition, and I think that's really exciting.
Those are excellent points. And I think we're going to let Paulina, who certainly last but certainly not least with regard to these things, who've kept us on the upper loop, and we've already talking about what is possible and what we need to do about it. So, Paulina, what were your key takeaways?
Thank you, Jim. And a lot of the points that Justine is making are making me think a lot about kind of moving forward in the future. And a lot of them are inspiring, and it makes me think about kind of next steps that we can take. I think that one of the biggest highlights for me is the importance of public education and engagement when it comes to the energy transition. Justine was talking about that we all have a role to play in this transition. And of course, that gets me very excited and very curious at the same time. And sometimes we might underestimate how critical it is to bring the public along on this ride. So at the end of the day, the success of the transition is not only on individuals, but on society, and if society buys in and demands for actual change. And I think that those things won't happen if we don't truly understand what's at stake and what's in it for us and our communities. I think that we have to get a lot better into breaking down these complex science and technologies into more relatable terms, maybe showing local impacts when we're talking about air quality, economic opportunities, energy costs, so that we can make it tangible. So maybe by using compelling storytelling or even experiential learning opportunities, it's a way of meeting people where they're at. So it's not lecturing from ivory towers, but it's getting into maybe school curricula, maybe holding space to have conversations so that thinking about the energy transition actually becomes second nature. Something that Justine was talking about is all the amazing people that we've talked to on the paths that we've created to contribute to this transition. And I also think that creating a more educated and energized public to its cores will kind of bring everybody in together in their efforts. So I think that's the only way to getting into policies and to infrastructure and building momentum when we realize where we want to go from here. I think that, as we've said before, the energy transition is up to you and me, and we're all in this together. So I think that making public education a priority through creativity, through empathy, is an important part and key into turning this Titanic ship around.
So I think to conclude these great insights is that to answer the question, are we ready? The answer is we've gotten started, and some places are a lot further along than others. But we're probably at the early stage of this journey, and we need to do more, and we probably need to do it a lot faster.
Yes, Jim. So how we address the energy transition today will determine the kind of future that we and later generations will have.
Because the energy transition is about the changes that we're willing to make as individuals and as a society. So until our next season, we hope you've understood and joined us on this ride by learning a little more about the story of the energy transition, because the energy transition is up to you and me.
And with that, season 1 is a wrap. Thank you so much for coming along on this journey with us. We hope you enjoyed listening to these conversations and learned a thing or two about the energy transition that you can share with a friend. And we hope that you will continue to stay involved in the energy transition, whatever that looks like for you.
We would like to thank the USC Ershaghi Center for Energy Transition, which aims to develop innovations in energy technologies and foster the transition to a lower carbon future, for sponsoring this podcast. Also, a special thanks to our many guests for today, and as always, to Abhi, our technical guru, for their important contributions to our podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to Energy Transition Talk. We would appreciate it so much if you could leave a rating and review and let us know what you thought about this episode, as well as any thoughts and suggestions you have for future seasons of the podcast. I'm Justine.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Paulina, signing off from Energy Transition Talk. Until next time.